Well, here we go. It's a special edition of Now and Next. Yes, we've been preoccupied with our daily edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. If you haven't dipped into that lately, do so. We are on Monday to Friday during the campaign, and all kinds of fun and games going on, as you know, vis-a-vis the election here in Ontario, the tariffs south of the border, what's going on in Ottawa for the federal leadership, etc. But I thought we needed to have a conversation about one of the top of mind issues we face right now, and that is coming up on both sides of this equation in terms of the federal politics, the provincial politics, and then the Trump politics, and that is national sovereignty. We record this on the 13th day of February, 2 days from Flag Day, celebrating 60 years of the Canadian flag, and I dare say this year that day will be marked by Canadians unlike any other, perhaps except for the first day we had Flag Day back in the 60s. So there has been a real push as a result of what's happened with the Trump administration. Give him his credit. Donald Trump has managed to unify the Middle East and Canada all at once. So perhaps he's on track for a Nobel Prize. And I'm not trying to be glib. I just think that the way people have responded to that is kind of interesting. But part of that is all about our sovereignty. And so I thought we should take advantage of Scott Clancy is here. He is the Major General. He's retired from the RCAF. And, you and I have chatted over the last few months just about, is the world a more dangerous place with or without Trump? And it was your view strenuously before Christmas that it would be a more dangerous place with him. Has any of that got more concerning to you since we've seen the Trump administration take hold?
Yes. Full stop.
Yeah.
You don't treat your friends and allies like this individual is treating Canada, Denmark, Greenland, Panama. You just don't. And if the answer is, well, you've been freeloading on our security for, okay, you know what? I think that you would have the vast majority of the security folks in defense and security within Canada vehemently agreeing with that statement. Let's develop a plan forward. That's not how this conversation is going. So what and the word betrayal is coming up a lot, especially with, people that I know that have worked in this defense and security sphere for a lot of years. And it's because we thought we had a relationship with our ally where you place that relationship well over top of whatever transactional issue that you're dealing with. Annexing Canada, you don't matter. I'm not going to defend you. What other beautiful quotes to this individual state? Canada would be better as being the 51st state. You don't have anything that we need. We don't need you. Okay. This becomes transactional. So I'm actually looking forward to Flag Day. I'm looking forward to all of this because whether it's, Prime Minister Trudeau and his comments, a few weeks ago on the Saturday before we thought those 25% tariffs were coming in, the provincial premiers, everybody is unified against this as being, this is a really bad idea and we have to stick together as Canadians. Everything after that is going to be good for Canada, but I think it's going to be hard for Canada in the short term.
Yeah, hard for Canada because I think, to your point, it's been a bit of a shock to the system to see that level of betrayal. And, it's funny, somebody was talking about a column they read in one of the Vancouver newspapers, and it was sort of a farewell to my friends in the United States. I'm going to miss you guys. I'm not going to be down there. I'm going to miss all these things, but I'm not going to put up with the BS anymore. And they were hearkening back to a commentary that was written in 1973 by Gordon Sinclair when he was doing his 10 to 12 newscast at CFRB, and it was called The Americans. And in the course of that commentary, he talked about how people were abandoning the Americans, despite the fact that post-Second World War, the world survived and stood up again because the Americans were there to help, get economies back, get infrastructure back. Whether there was natural disaster, the Americans were there. And Gordon kept pounding, who did it? Was the Americans. If who's building great aircraft? It's the Americans. Who's sending people to the moon? It's the Americans. And now when you look at what's going on in Washington, it's the exact opposite of what Gordon Sinclair was celebrating. That, in fact, this is beyond, I think, any of our concept of isolationism in the United States. You talked about us being friends. I'm not sure that plays anymore. There are no allies. There are no trusted friends in the circle of the Americans. And as glib as that might sound, you will know better. But that puts the world at risk, no, from a security perspective.
Well, it definitely puts Canada at risk. And if you hearken to the comments that Pete Hegseth said at the NATO Ministers Conference yesterday, and is reiterating around the tables again this morning, I think that this is a much more dangerous place writ large. So here's a few things. The Secretary of Defense has said that European security needs to be guaranteed first and foremost by Europeans, and that the United States is not in the business of coming to their aid. You need to spend 5% of your GDPs. We are now shifting focus to the security of North America and dealing with our major adversary, China. All of those things, the 5%, pivoting towards China, all the rest that can be true without the underlying idea of, hey, listen, we're not going to come to your aid. Now, I will say that from a Canadian perspective, it puts me in a real conundrum, because for a long time I've been saying, what does NATO give to Canada? Forget the United States just for a second. But if Canada ever got attacked by a major adversary, the day after Article 5 would or would not have been invoked, then that phone call was going to come to the Department of National Defense and the key armed forces to send troops to Europe to defend it. Now, hold on for a second. Canada just got attacked, and you think we need to send troops to Latvia? I don't understand. Like, I don't understand. But now we're looking at the principal adversary that we might be facing is the United States of America. I've been pretty vocal about the fact that Canada's kind of waking up to what Thomas Hobbes would call the state of nations, where it really is no rules outside of that which you can garner and put your judiciary over inside of your nation. And we're seeing the dismantling of the rules-based order writ large. I'll annex Greenland, I'll annex Panama Canal, I'll do whatever I want in Gaza, and Canada will be the 51st state or a vassal state. What Canada needs to come to grips with is being willing to go all in and do whatever it takes to guarantee itself as a nation. And that might mean a lot of things into the future. My concern is we're going to fight politically on the battlefields of immigration, fentanyl, trade deficit. Pick the issue du jour, but that's really not what the underlying desire is here, right? Because if you solve, first of all, there is no fentanyl issue. Second of all, we have to tighten up immigration and things like this. But quite honestly, as it compares to the problem that the Americans have south of the border, it's actually a nothing burger. And I can make the case to say, what about the 30,000 guns that travel across the American border going north? These are more of a threat to our national sovereignty than any kind of fentanyl moving south of the border is. But getting past that, these are not the issues. It's what is Canada's reaction going to be that at one point in time that American president is going to point to and say, that's a national security issue. Now we're coming after you because it's now different, because you're using any excuse to justify your actions. That's what I worry about.
And any excuse from that perspective being, it could be water, it could be minerals, it could be anything that they decide that they need or want. It's more to the point, right? So when you talked about it off the top, though, in terms of that relationship, and it's at a very high level, and then we deal with the transactional material on a daily basis, and we get along. In your former role at NORAD, what's the culture in there? Because I can't imagine that, okay, the Canadians are on that side of the room and the Americans are on that side of the room. You guys had to be on the same page all the time, no?
So like any relationship that you had, and I used to characterize the relationship that we had with our American counterparts as like with your twin brother, right? If you have a twin brother, they look like you, they talk like you, they sound like you, hell, to most everybody else, you're identical. So you start defining yourself by, I have a mole on my hip that he doesn't have. I like country music. He likes rock. Like it's those kinds of things, but they look peripheral to everybody else around. But the more that we pull on this, the more that we see that there are core issues at the heart of what Canadians believe: respect for the rule of law, respect for individuals and all individual rights, to include LGBTQ, and I can keep on going, universal health care and everything else. And by the way, and this is a sidebar, if you think the United States of America and annexing Canada is going to give 40 some million Canadians a vote in any election in the future, you have another thing coming, because they're never, ever, no Republican president is ever going to take on this. So it's not like adding California and its votes to the union. That's not going to be the case, right? You'll have no representation. Your institutions, you'll be governed by a military governor. You'll become a vassal state to the United States. That's exactly what that's going to look like, because everything else becomes something contrary to the manifest destiny of the United States. But putting that aside, like when you're sitting in those meetings, there's very specific meetings at times where you're going, no, General, you're not going to do that. And, and I'm speaking specifically of a commander of NORAD who says, yeah, we're going to go to in this, and it all in the defense of North America, all with good intentions of getting after things. But the way in which they're going to do it is going to be contrary to Canadian law. And, people like me and people around very senior levels going, no, sir, you're not going to do that. You're going to do what I tell you to do, General. And then I said, you can't bully me to in a corner. Let's be clear. That's a Canadian flag back there. That's a Canadian flag on my shoulder. I work for the government of Canada. That's against Canadian law. And the first phone call I'm going to make is back to Ottawa. And the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a phone call from our prime minister saying, hey, stop, because, and a little bit of being a good friend and a good ally is telling them when they're wrong. Like, your good friends, they have your back, but at the same time, they're the ones saying, hey, you shouldn't have punched that guy in that bar last night. Like, it really wasn't a good idea. And you have to be less like that and more conciliatory. So you should go over and say, you're sorry. These are the kinds of things that good allies and friends do. So it isn't always conciliatory. But what I will tell you is, because that relationship, I always saw that relationship as being so important, anything that we ever got into in terms of a tiff, that went by very, very quickly. And we focused on that relationship. I still call a lot of my American counterparts and say, I love you, brother. I'd fight and die for you. But this is causing me so much angst here now, that because it's different. You're not saying, hey, I think there's an issue with trade and we have to work out. You're saying you should cease to exist and I should own you. Actually, you're not even saying it with that mean. You're saying you should cease to exist. I should own you. You don't actually mean anything to me. And the condescending nature of what that is bringing us to a stark reality of what we have to do. So yeah, it's not all conciliatory. What I say spies, my friends that are still in down there are finding this very tough environment to work in. Now, I will say that I have a little bit of insight into this. During the first Trump administration, I was in Alaska and then in Colorado Springs, and I had a front row seat for January 6th. So I saw exactly what these kinds of things. And if we remember, Donald Trump signed in his first administration an executive order to place military troops on the northern border. Now, because the Congress had sway with that, it was never enacted. But I told my 3-star American boss at the time when I was in Alaska, because he was going to have to take command of those troops. Same boss that was doing the NORAD defense was going to have troops pointed at the Canadian border. I said, I will resign my commission the instant that order is enacted through your chain of command. I will resign my commission and I will be leaving as fast as I can the United States, never to return. And it's because it strikes the foundation of what the alliance is based upon. I think that the folks down there are living through an inordinately difficult time, praying and hoping against hope that they can just provide some stability, military stability, that the alliance is stable, that everything's fine, everything's going on, and allow the political machinations to move off. I'm not so sure that's going to be able to happen.
Along with that is all the focus on, upping our investment in NATO, which Mr. Hegseth on the one hand saying, Europe goes out on its own, but at the same time insisting that, we push investment to 5% of GDP to NATO, et cetera. Against that backdrop, this past week, we've got the leader of the Conservatives up in Nunavut and just saying, well, we're going to put a military base up here because we're going to take away all of our foreign aid investment. And there was a lot of pushback because didn't really talk to anybody up there about it before he made the comment. And you know the North as well as anybody else. That's not really the cultural thing that flies very well. But let's just get past that for a second. The cost of doing that, the investment in doing that, the actual political and policy pivot that would have to happen to do that in a very short period of time, based on the conversation, how likely is that?
Well, it's not. But I've been a real proponent of the political powers needing to lead and decide what the right thing to do is, and then just do it, even if it's not necessarily the most popular thing. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that they should just put the base up there and not talk to the indigenous populations. And yes, I do have, my dealings in the North a significant amount for this. But I think that the opening shot should be, we're going to establish a permanent military presence in Nunavut. We want to engage the local population about what that looks like, so that we can best see how that is mutually beneficial for national sovereignty, for our presence, for making sure that federal government has its responsibilities of what it's going to do, and has the maximum benefit for the local population, because then we can develop things together where common infrastructure and roads and aerodromes and whatever else might be as beneficial for the community populations as they are to the Department of National Defense. We have a requirement at the federal level to maintain presence in the North. We're going to do that. Now let's engage in the conversation as to how best to do that with our, territorial and provincial partner up north. So I think that's how I would go about this. Yeah, it's a bit of a slap on the face, but I think he's onto something. Presence and sovereignty have always been, inherently linked. For people who don't kind of get that, let's just say you go to Afghanistan and you hold up in a forward operating base, and then you just sit there. Well, if you don't go out and patrol and put your people out on the run, and then you haven't really established any presence there. And if it's fleeting, if you never go to this portion of that country or this portion of that country, then someone could make the case to say, do you really own that? Because you look weak, you look like you're ignoring / disinterested in it. And then people are questioning whether or not you actually should be exercising sovereignty over, I don't know, the entire archipelago. So, it's not just about where your population centers are and where your people are. It's also where you put those elements of national power to demonstrate that sovereignty. And for the longest time, I've been a proponent of permanently basing in the North. But I'll tell you, there's a trade-off here with Europe. And I think there's a trade-off with NORAD. And as we have these enhancing conversations about what it means to secure the North and provide defense and security, via presence in the North. So we're sending a brigade to Latvia because we insist upon, and that's important, all the rest of the stuff. And I get that part for countering Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, the infrastructure required to secure and defend North America against its threats is the most waning and old portions of our defense infrastructure that exists. The North warning system is, from the 1980s and hasn't been upgraded and all. Oh, we're going to get to that. When? Okay, well, then maybe we should not deploy 3,000 troops to Latvia, and maybe we should be putting, even partially present people around our northern elements. So I think there's a real coming to grips with exactly what it means to spend. On 5%, I will say, even if getting to 2%, if the Canadian military was charged with developing even periodic for the next 4 to 5 years until they can develop, how that long-term basing is. If they were told you will develop infrastructure and peace that you can fall in on a continuous basis in the North, you could get via contracts to a lot of expenditure. As we know, developing things in the North is very expensive. You could get to a lot of those defense expenditures very, very quickly by contracting Northern and Canadian businesses to do so, which provides mutual benefit here to the communities that you're doing it with.
Let me just go back to your point around, sending troops versus investing in the North. Does it have to be an either or?
No, absolutely has to be both.
Right.
It absolutely has to be both. You're not going to put a permanent presence in the north without developing a telecommunications infrastructure that can support everybody and the community around it. You're not going to provide a telecommunications infrastructure only to the Canadian Forces base that's there, while the local community, can't even access email. Like, all of those things have to go hand in foot. And the whole point with this is, and I've said this a bunch, you've got communities up in the north that are trying to eke out existence, and we're trying to provide development to enable that existence. That's actually not the bar we should be looking for. We need flourishing communities in the north. That's what's going to enhance our sovereignty and security in the north, is flourishing communities that people love. They latch on to Canada because Canada has been, a beacon of enabling them to maneuver with this. In my conversations with some of the Indigenous populations, and I can get pretty brusque. I'm a general, so stick with that. Where I'll say things like, I don't necessarily need the Arctic to defend Canada and North America. That's just not true. And some of the responses from the people in the north said, and if we don't like the way that Canada governs, maybe we'll look somewhere else for where our sovereignty lies. And Canadians should latch onto that a little bit. The Indigenous populations don't necessarily see the Canadian government and Canadian way of life any different than, and I hearken to say, maybe even Russia or some of the other, maybe the transactional relationship that they could get into with somebody else might be better for them in the long term. Even opening that conversation means that, okay, we've got a lot of work to do with respect to establishing that relationship that we need to have with our Indigenous populations. So if we could take a lesson from this crisis with the United States, we went from thinking that we had a friendship, alliance, a real relationship, multifaceted. There's all sorts of connective tissue between us and the Americans. And we're finding that to be very transactional now. The resounding silence from my thousands of friends south of the border that are not coming clean with, that's wrong, Scott, we're with you, like, even privately. That's fascinating to me, right? Maybe we need to take that vision and look at the relationship that we have with our Indigenous and Northern populations and say, so have we been the Donald Trump of Canada for the last 60, 70 years? Oh, okay. And if we're going to be honest about that, and the role of reconciliation in this, being honest with that and saying, okay, I don't want to be that guy anymore. I want to be here. And I think of the things we could do for national sovereignty in that is approach things like that. And then development and defense and all the rest of those things, they'll flow out of that relationship. So the relationship has to be the most important thing here.
So we've been transactional in our dealings with the North more than relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. And our Indigenous populations, you signed a treaty. Therefore, that's what the treaty is like. And then we looked at policy and things like this to manage. Hold on for a second. How about we just put all those documents off to the side? Let's have a conversation about needs and national interests and desires and things like this, and populations and rights and who's okay. Good. Okay. So if we're going to rewrite this Indian Act thing without rewriting it, but it'll form the basis of our relationship, what would it be based upon? It'd be based upon these things. Okay, good. I agree. And then successive governments that come in just fall on top of that exact same thing. And that relationship needs to be not fleeting because because Pierre Poilievre stood on a tarmac in Iqaluit and said, we're going to do this. It's because successive Canadian governments believe in the same concepts, that this relationship will be an ongoing, enduring, and positive relationship for both parties because we say that we want it to be.
Yeah, there's not necessarily a winner or a loser, which is pretty much the posture of the Americans right now. Before we go, it was in the last 24 hours. It was sort of a head spinning moment and a lot of breathless reporting on breaking news. We're told that Donald Trump had a 90-minute conversation with Vladimir Putin about peace in Ukraine, failing to include the Ukrainians in that conversation. I don't know where that puts Europe, never mind Ukraine. And it's I'm doing it just because I feel like doing it posture. How do you possibly prepare for that kind of eventuality when it could be popping up like any whack-a-mole situation? You never know what you're going to get in a given moment, never mind a day or a week or a month.
So, great point, right? Do you think about trying to preempt what's in the head of Donald Trump? But I will say, people might be disappointed. They might have all sorts of emotional reactions with respect to, waking up this morning and listening to that news or last night. But he signaled that very clearly, in his lead up to election, that he was going to end the war in Ukraine. People have asked me, well, how does he end the war in Ukraine? Like, how does an American president end the war in Ukraine? And I've always said he's only got two levers as it pertains to Ukraine itself and the war. First one is he can put American troops on the ground in Ukraine, drawing NATO de facto into an Article 5 global confrontation with Russia. He can remove all the lethal aid from Ukraine. Either one of those two things is game-changing and conflict-ending for Ukraine, right? Like, one way or another. You're going to escalate it or you're going to end, because Ukraine cannot survive. There's no way that the European Union countries and all the rest of the NATO countries can make up for the delta that the United States, Europe still provides about 55% of the lethal, non-lethal aid to Ukraine. They'd have to make up another 47%. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. Their machines, the time that it would take for the defense industry to ramp up, it's just not possible for them to make that up. Hence the peace deal. Now, in all of that, trying to preempt what Donald Trump is going to do, Canada has found it, very difficult as well with respect to this. But I think that Ukraine is reacting exactly the same way that Canada is. Our powder is still dry. We're not sitting here eviscerating. You don't hear the Prime Minister of Canada eviscerating the United States, because we still have to have that relationship there where you keep your powder dry as it pertains to that. People like me saying, inflammatory things perhaps, but not the government. And then you fight those battles of what those individual issues are. So what I have heard from the Ukrainian reaction this morning, whether it's their Minister of Defense, who's been speaking at the NATO Ministers Conference that Pete Hegseth was speaking at yesterday, or whether it's members of their parliament and Vladimir Zelensky himself, there's three things that come out to me. The first one is they want a diplomatic solution. I think this is a result of the fact that they know that lethal aid from the United States is about to end. Second thing is that forcing Putin to the negotiating table is a good thing. It is. It's just a good thing. So those two things sit in their psyche, very, very strong. And then the third thing is that they want real security guarantees moving into the future as it pertains to their territory. So whether it's about the pre-2014 borders versus now, those other things, what the Ukrainian people are waking up to is the condescending and overbearing way in which the United States and Russia are going to negotiate a settlement that, and will involve you peripherally in it. Donald Trump's comments about, it's an interesting question as to whether we involve the Ukrainians and with what role in their own, where, no peace in Ukraine without Ukraine being involved has been the postmark of how we push forward in the future. I think that the Ukrainians are waking up to, I've got a transactional relationship with the one person in the one country that's actually going to guarantee our security. Let's fight on the battlegrounds that we know. If we want a diplomatic solution, if we want Putin at the negotiating table, and we want real security guarantees, let's focus on those three things and let's be pragmatic about it. The other things that are around the outside of this, and the whole way in which Donald Trump honors a vicious aggressor that's going to, attack at will, a country, a sovereign country that's his neighbor. Quite honestly, you're best not dealing with that. The same way that Canada's government is best not necessarily dealing with the fact that the United States wants to annex Canada, or at least the president is saying that they want to annex Canada and make it because what you would have to go to in terms of a war footing to be able to do that is probably going to undo what you might have been able to achieve in terms of staying the execution on that course of action, sort of thing. So to me, I think there's some real parallels here with how transactionally those countries are going to deal with it. But be clear, I think everybody in Europe especially is waking up this morning going, wow, that Atlantic looks a lot wider today than it ever looked in the previous 40, 50 years.
Yeah, well, back to the original point you made, the world is a far more dangerous place than it was on November the 4th. So
agreed.
Scott Clancy, thank you. It's always good to get your insight, and you never stumble for an answer. You just your experience comes to the fore, and it's great to have that clarity. So thanks for being here.
I translate that as I talk good. Is that
You talk good.
Thanks, David. It's always a pleasure. You ask great questions, and I think they're really important to talk about.
Good to have you. Thanks.
All right, take care.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Erin Trafford, Queen of the Universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.